Now, Final Fantasy XVI is a game I've been looking forward to since the day it was announced, and as somebody who has played every Final Fantasy, yes, that includes the mobile and online ones, imagine my delight and surprise to discover that Square Enix had offered me an early copy of the game so that I could bring you guys both this review and a ton of videos for Final Fantasy XVI to come. Now, is this game the return to form that we've all been waiting for? Have the team at Creative Business Unit 3 struck gold once again like they did with 14? And most importantly, is it actually Final Fantasy? The answers to all of these questions and more are right here in this video review. So I'm going to start off by saying that this game is massive. As of the filming of this video, I'm about 60 hours deep into Final Fantasy XVI, and I have finished the main campaign of the game, and I've done a good chunk of the side content that's available, but certainly not all of it. So for those of you who are worrying about the game being shorter than previous Final Fantasies, allow me to alleviate those fears for you immediately. Anyone who's looking for a game to really sink their teeth into for a long period of time need not look further than this title. And having also recently discovered the Final Fantasy mode alluded to in recent coverage for the game, I still have a long way to go. Now, anyone who's even seen a trailer for Final Fantasy XVI knows just how stunning it looks, with epic scale all the way down to the minute details. And as I said in my coverage of the demo that released recently, which you should absolutely go and try if you're considering picking up Final Fantasy XVI, the trailers don't do the game justice in terms of how it looks. Now, the Final Fantasy name has always been attached to impressive visuals, sweeping orchestral numbers, epic set pieces, and in that regard, Final Fantasy XVI goes above and beyond anything we've seen before. The music team, helmed by Masayoshi Sokun, and their impressive range in music composition is in full display here. And from main character Clive Rossfield all the way down to even minor characters, there is a staggering amount of detail in both their visual design and also their voice acting, which, speaking of the voice acting, the entire cast of Final Fantasy XVI sets an incredibly high bar for any new games that follow this, though to be honest with you, none of this is really surprising given the pedigree of the team that created Final Fantasy XVI, with it being Creative Business Unit 3, the team that created Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, at the helm, including of course the legendary Yoshi P. Speaking of Final Fantasy XIV, in the long amount of time I've spent with FF16 already, I was shocked at quite how much this game bears a resemblance to Final Fantasy XIV, especially given how different the combat is from previous entries in the franchise. Quest progression is practically identical to the MMORPG, with a main scenario to progress, a smattering of side quests, of which there are a large number, and additional activities such as hunts or arcade mode and all sorts of other bits and pieces, culminating in a really massive and yet somehow very complete package. Addressing the elephant in the room, I've seen many a time people on the internet claiming that FF16 somehow isn't a Final Fantasy at all. But the truth of the matter is that Final Fantasy's always kind of pushed the envelope as to what it is for many years, even before the golden age of titles like Final Fantasy VI and VII. And while the combat is very different from anything that we've seen in Final Fantasy before, it still somehow feels very Final Fantasy, and it resembles the other games of the franchise in a lot of ways, certainly outside of combat, especially Final Fantasy XIV, even more so than titles dating all the way back to Final Fantasy X, which is a game I found myself reminded of a lot whilst exploring Valisthea on the back of my Chocobo, looking for endgame content, of which there has been tons, some of which I haven't even tapped into yet. Speaking of that huge number of side quests, a lot of them do start out quite meek in nature, but as the game progresses, you'll come to love a lot of the characters that are involved in them and become really invested on how their quest lines progress and also in their eventual payoff. There are peaks and valleys very present when it comes to any kind of JRPG, and there's definitely at present in 16, largely resembling 14, almost too much in some cases. So while the peaks of the game story are incredibly high, they are really, really high. Get ready to get those tissues, and also be ready to have your jaw hit the floor multiple times while playing this game. There are times in the story, particularly early on, which feel really quite demure for extended periods of time, which is kind of surprising given how explosive the opening hours of the game are.
They were laughing.
Now, there's going to be two distinctive camps of people probably playing Final Fantasy 16. You have the players of high-octane action games like Devil May Cry, from which Final Fantasy 16 borrows its combat director, and veteran players for Final Fantasy from decades past who are there for that massively sprawling story. And the juxtaposition of that deep, high-octane combat and the storylines might be a little jarring for people to get used to from either one of those camps, but once the player settles in for the ride, it's a hell of a ride that they're going to be on. So getting stuck into the meat of the combat of Final Fantasy 16, as someone who's played a lot of games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Ninja Gaiden, etc. and loved them, it's one of the best examples of this kind of combat I've seen in recent memory from a video game. It's so malleable and customizable, and it allows players from all sorts of approaches to combat to get their fill of how they want to approach each individual encounter. Players who are used to the likes of Devil May Cry can get stuck in with skill sets obtained from early icons, the iconic, forgive the pun, creatures from which Clive draws his abilities from, such as Phoenix and Garuda, while players who are less comfortable getting in close may opt for a more ranged approach, which you'd get from other icons down the line. Now, there are quite large gaps in time between obtaining new icons, which gives the player a lot of time to get used to each new one they approach, and new abilities are obtained pretty much the entire way through the game, all the way up into the end. Though, because there's a slower pacing to this, players who are used to always getting something new like every level may find that it's a bit slower paced than they're used to, particularly early on in the game. But once you start acquiring a couple of new icons, the freedom to mix and match abilities from various icons, because if you master an ability, you can then equip it to any other icon, because your options become huge. There's so many different ways in which you can play the game that it's staggering, and yet because of the slow pacing, it never feels overwhelming. As a matter of fact, I fully intend on making videos entirely dedicated to the combat in this game because of how deep it can be. So if you want to know more about that, let me know in the comments below what kinds of things you want to see with regards to combat. So I touched a little bit on the characters in Final Fantasy 16 based on how they look, how they sound, but I didn't talk about the actual characterizations of them until this point. Final Fantasy 16 is some of my favourite Final Fantasy characters in the entire franchise, which is a tall order given the pedigree of the characters we've seen in Final Fantasy games previously. Whether it be the dominants themselves, so the carriers of the icons, or some of the minor characters in the game, some of the sort of villainous characters in the game, they're all brilliant and have something to offer in the grand scale of what's happening in Valisthea. Now, I'm not going to tell you who my favourite characters are or why I feel that way about those characters. I just wanted you to know that the characters in FF16 as an ensemble are some of the best that we've ever seen. And I don't think it's much of a spoiler for me to say that Torgal is just as amazing as you would hope he had been from the trailer. Now, if I were to give FF16 any criticism, and I can only of course speak from my own experience, which may or may not match up to the opinions of others, I felt that the pacing of the early game was a little bit on the slow side. Now, I had that criticism for Final Fantasy XIV as well, but a lot of people I speak to really love the way that that game is paced, and because that's present in FF16 as well, I reckon those people will really love that too. It's just not something that I'm used to as somebody who likes a lot of action games and is used to kind of that go, go, go mentality, where there are going to be periods of time where you're kind of on the lowdown. And additionally, those looking for a tangible reward, like a new weapon, a new accessory in every side quest, may not find that in every side quest when it comes to this game, because sometimes the reward is the lore itself, which is wonderful for lore junkies. That doesn't describe everybody that plays these games. But saying that, the lore of Valisthea and how rich the world of it is kind of convincing me to go that way into the lore junkie side anyway. As I said earlier, the gap between obtaining icons is quite large, and at least at the very beginning of the game, I did find that until I started obtaining other icons, the combat did feel a little dry just before I started obtaining them, a little longer than I would have liked, but those feelings were assuaged very quickly once I started obtaining more abilities. And the more I played the game, the more rich it became, and the more I became sucked into it. I will also say, as somebody who is not particularly fussed about like has to be 60 frames per second at all times, every time, the frame rate can be a little bit wobbly on Final Fantasy 16 occasionally. It is something that I know people will want to know. It's never something that detracted from my experience with the game, but it was something that I noticed that I felt that people should probably know. Before we continue, please don't forget to check out all of my social links in the description box below, including Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and Patreon. Of course, over on Twitch, I'm going to be streaming a lot of Final Fantasy 16 related content, so it would be lovely to come and see you over there. If you have any questions about the game, or if you're stuck and you need a hand, come and find me over on Twitch and we can talk about it more there. It'd be lovely to hang out. And of course, I do always give a shout out at random to one of my patrons over on Patreon every time I release a new video. And today that person's going to be Kuran, who's been a supporter of mine for a little while now. Thank you ever so much. They have Stola on their title card, and it means so much that I have the support from you and from everyone else on my Patreon. If you'd like a title card made for you just like this, then perhaps you'd like to consider clicking on the link in the description box for that too. So let's bring up the little discussion. How Final Fantasy is Final Fantasy 16? Well, I suppose that depends on what your definition of Final Fantasy is. If FF is about turn-based combat or a wide variety of playable characters in a party for you, then sure, FF16 is quite a departure from previous games due to its heavier emphasis on action-based combat. And honestly, I respect that. And I expect that you've already made up your mind about 16, as the skill set that is required for this game is different to the games that we've had in the past, like Final Fantasy V, which is a Final Fantasy that 16 references quite a lot, which fills me with joy as 5 is one of my favorites in the entire franchise. But if Final Fantasy is about epic stories of love, war, and crystals, lovable characters, and epic set pieces, and of course a wide variety of different activities, then Final Fantasy 16 is the most Final Fantasy game I've played in a very long time. So in conclusion, I loved Final Fantasy 16. It was breathtaking to look at. I cried more than once. My jaw hit the floor more than once. And the combat was so refreshing and just really, really satisfying to play that I expect to be playing this game for at least another 60 hours on top of the 60 I've already put in, if not more. And because of that, I hope to bring you all a ton of content about it. And because of that, definitely consider clicking that subscribe button, liking the video, and click the bell for notifications too, so that you can get access to all that juicy 16 content. And once again, I would love to thank Square Enix for allowing me to be even a small part of the release of this wonderful game, for gifting me an early access copy so that I can share this review and my thoughts with you all, and also for inviting me to events relating to Final Fantasy 16. The 10-year-old in me is crying out in glee over what's been happening recently, so I'm extremely grateful. I actually really strongly believe that Final Fantasy 16 is going to bring a massive new audience to the franchise, and I hope that those newcomers will look forward to other titles in the franchise, such as 7.0 for Final Fantasy 14 or FF7 Rebirth, and I hope that veterans will see this and just go, ooh, perhaps I'll revisit this, because there's such a wonderful game to look at. There's so much joy to be had with it too, and I really hope that you guys all enjoy it as much as I have. Which means, I suppose the only question left now is where 16 ranks among my favourite Final Fantasies. What do you think?